in the multilateral forums, number of countries coming together to jointly explore something. For example, in G7, the G7 formed what is called the Mineral Security Partnership. Yeah, Mineral Security Partnership, which committed those 7 countries to work together to understand the space better and develop joint strategies. We have been part of some of the exercises as part of the G20 grouping, and working with the ministry and other stakeholders. Again, there is some consensus that is drawing upon there, which says there is while there are lots of other framings like G7 and others, G20 seems to be a more broader grouping, and whether something can come out of that. So the idea for this session stemmed from that, because even if you look at G20, it's just 20 countries, and maybe few other invitees, who would be called upon by the host and others. But even that is a very small, representative sample. Asia is a large continent, and number of countries here. It's definitely more than what a G20 or a G7 can offer. And we should remember that, climate change is an issue which is going to affect all of us. And, just restricting these access to minerals and others to a very select group of countries, that's not the way to go. We are in a boat where we either sink or sail together. So keeping that perspective, we thought we would design this session to look at what can be a continent-wide approach. Are there, does it even make sense to talk about such an approach? I think that's the set of ideas that we'll be deliberating today. I'd like to conclude by saying that, when the whole of Asia comes together, either for Asian Games or for Asia Clean Energy Forum. So I think this is a good place to have these discussions, and, wishing everyone a happy set of deliberations today. Thank you. Kunal, over to you.
Thank you, Deepak, for setting the stage for this side event. I hope you all can hear me. Maybe I don't need the mic. Oh, all right. There you go. Okay. I now call upon Niharika Tagotra. Dr. Niharika Tagotra is a senior research specialist at WRI India's energy program. Before joining WRI, she was working as an energy consultant at the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. She's also the NBR Asia Edge Fellow for the year 2021-22. Niharika has a master's in nuclear physics and a PhD in international politics from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. I call upon Niharika to make the presentation now.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Can we have the presentation on screen, please? Right. So my presentation is going to now focus on securing critical minerals for energy transition goals in Asia Pacific. It's going to focus on some of the challenges and issues that the region is going to face, most probably going into the future, considering the energy transition goals that some of the Asia Pacific countries have set for themselves. All right. Just setting the context here, when we talk of the Asia-Pacific region, it remains vulnerable to the changing climate, considering that this is one of the fastest growing regions in the world, with its total GDP accounting for approximately 37% of the global GDP, which is expected to rise to 42% by 2040. It's also home to some of the largest CO2 emitters in the world, although the anomaly here being that the per capita emissions remain among the lowest for these countries. The region also remains vulnerable to climate change induced disasters, considering that in the 3 years between 2014 and 2017, there were a number of climate change induced events, including storms, cyclones, and severe flooding that not only caused a loss of lives, but also impacted the national economies, livelihoods, and communities. The region counts for about 13 of the 30 countries which are likely to be adversely impacted by extreme weather events. And considering its contribution to the global economy, it also remains critical in the global efforts towards mitigating climate change. When we talk about the energy future of the Asia-Pacific region, we can see that as the economies grow, by 2050, the power demand is set to grow in the region by 50%. This is the power demand that's set to grow globally by 50%, and Asia-Pacific region is to contribute nearly 2/3 of this demand. Within these countries, when we talk of the ASEAN countries, for example, the renewable energy share is expected to rise to 65% in its total energy share by 2050. By 2030, the solar PV installation in the region will increase to 240 gigawatts. There will be 13 million battery EVs on the road and about 3.7 million charging stations within the ASEAN region. The next country is China, which is which has announced its plans to become carbon neutral by 2060. With wind and solar expected to increase nearly 7-fold. And that's going to account for about 80% of the generation of the country by 2060. India too has announced its plans to become carbon neutral by 2070, with the additional plans of installing about 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. Japan plans to be carbon neutral by 2050, and about 50 to 60% of its total power is going to be met through renewable energy. Australia's clean energy transition will include a 9-fold increase in its grid scale wind and solar installation to about 141 gigawatt. Its storage capacity expected to increase 30-fold. Its electricity usage is expected to nearly double by 2050. Now, this massive energy transition is going to require certain minerals which are going to be critical to the manufacture of some of these technologies. The data that has been gathered by some of these agencies indicate about nearly a 500% rise in the demand between now and 2050 for certain minerals, including graphite, lithium, and cobalt. For some of these other minerals, this demand is expected to increase from, say, by between 100 to 200%. And this massive increase in demand is one of the factors that's going to remain significant going forward up until 2050. Now, why are we focusing on critical mineral requirements for the Asia-Pacific region? That's because when we talk of critical minerals, the Asia-Pacific region has its own peculiarities. It has its own trajectory in terms of its demand. And the speciality about this region is that it is not only looking at a massive, a rapid deployment of clean energy technology at a massive scale, but the region is also home to some of these minerals that have been identified critical to the energy transition goals. Countries in the Asia Pacific require to produce clean energy technologies, which would imply a ramp up in the domestic production of these minerals or increase in the import of these minerals. The region is a major producer of both clean energy technologies and critical minerals. Malaysia and Vietnam, for example, are major producers of solar panels. Thailand has the world's 11th largest automotive sector, and Indonesia is already integrating itself into the EV value chain. On the mineral side, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Philippines have large reserves of some of these minerals, including nickel and cobalt. Australia is the world's largest lithium producer. And very interestingly, recently, lithium reserves to the tune of 6 million tons were also discovered in India. These countries are important in playing various roles in various stages of critical minerals and associated value chains. Mining and quarrying are already an important part of the economies of some of the Asian Pacific countries. For instance, it accounts for 9% of Indonesia's GDP and about 3% of Thailand's GDP. It also accounts for about 1 to 2% share in total employment in Malaysia and Myanmar and Indonesia. This is sort of an indication of the minerals that can be found in the Asia Pacific countries. Like I said, the region is home to some of these reserves that remain largely untapped as on date. Now, when we talk about the vulnerabilities framework for the Asia Pacific region, there are three categories under which we are going to sort of characterize these vulnerabilities. These include security of supplies for these minerals, the resilience of supply chains of these minerals, and the sustainability of supplies for these minerals. When we talk of security of supplies, this theme focuses on how diversified are the value and production chains of critical minerals, and what is the impact of volatility of prices of critical minerals on the supplies of these minerals in the region. When we talk of resilience of supplies, we are also going to look at what is the ability of the region to recover from a probable disruption in supply chains of these minerals, what are some of the import dependencies for the minerals, and what does the regional trade of critical minerals looks like. In terms of sustainability, we look at the maintenance of the ESG norms for mining and processing. We also look at waste and wastewater management and the deforestation challenges which impact local communities' lives and livelihoods. Now, when we talk of the vulnerabilities of critical mineral supplies in the Asia Pacific region, there are certain points that we explore in detail. The first point being that, this is being discussed very frequently when we talk of vulnerabilities in critical mineral supply chains, which is the high geographical concentration of these minerals, leaving these supply chains vulnerable to disruption and causing volatility in prices. There is also an observed regional concentration of trade of critical minerals vis-a-vis the final products, which are the clean energy technologies, which creates high import dependencies and vulnerabilities in supply chains of these minerals. The social and environmental impacts of these minerals, of the mining of these minerals needs to be assessed. We also need to look at some of the wasteful mining practices and the deforestation challenges that the region faces. There is also a perceptible lack of suitable alternatives because there are high technical complexities which are associated with recycling and recovery of these minerals. And finally, we also look at the investment in critical mineral supply chains in the region, which remains insufficient despite a high concentration of reserves. So these are some of the points when we look at high concentration and price volatility in the critical minerals. It becomes very pronounced, the fact that these remain, some of these minerals remain highly concentrated in certain geographies. For instance, in cobalt, we have the DRC supplying about 70% of the world's cobalt requirements. The BRC supplies about 60% of the rare earth elements. Indonesia supplies about 40% of nickel, and Australia supplies about 55% of lithium. These percentages sort of indicate how concentrated these minerals are in some of the countries, and these create challenges and raise questions on the security of supplies. The challenges became more pronounced during the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, the ongoing geopolitical tensions have impacted the cost of these minerals, coupled with the rise in demand. when we compared the prices of, for instance, lithium, it was nearly 4 times higher in 2022 than in 2019. And even for minerals like cobalt and nickel, the prices have almost doubled over a span of the last 4 years. The final products, for instance, the solar PV grade polysilicon, and some of these elements such as copper and steel have also doubled over the last 2 years. There is 25% rise in prices of solar PV modules and a 20% rise in prices of wind turbines. This has happened over the last 2 to 4 years, when the demand for these for the clean energy technologies grow as the countries move towards achieving their net zero goals. We can anticipate much more pressure on prices, and we can anticipate a concomitant rise in prices for some of these minerals and clean energy technologies. Moving from high geographical concentration, we also look at a high regional concentration of trade in minerals and materials. A sort of an assessment of how the minerals are traded. One of the characteristics that has come out within our own research is that these minerals are heavily traded regionally, especially lithium and cobalt. About 4/5 of the cobalt production and about 50% of lithium are traded across regions, as the ores are often refined in China. The share of production of critical minerals, the share of trade in the production of critical minerals, for example, lithium carbonate, is generally low. Interestingly, the final products, which is the clean energy technologies and products, except for solar PV modules, are also less heavily traded. Some of the major Asian economies like China, Japan, and Korea are heavy exporters of most of these clean energy technologies, but they are also heavily dependent on imports of critical minerals to meet their energy needs. Asian economies, for instance, Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam, are now shaping strategies to capitalize on the global rush to access some of these critical minerals. So this chart is more indicative of the share of inter-regional trade in global production for some of these minerals. When you compare it with the share of inter-regional trade for, say, crude oil and natural gas, we realize that the share of inter-regional trade for some of these critical minerals is higher than the conventional fossil fuels. And it remains, except for solar PV modules, like I said, it remains very low for the final products, for the final clean energy technologies. Discussing also the negative social and environmental impacts of critical minerals is also important for the Asia Pacific region, considering that most of these reserves currently remain largely untapped, and they are found in geographies that are covered by tropical rainforests and tropical ecosystems. And deforestation of these ecosystems is a major concern for some of these economies and threatening to disproportionately impact these countries. That's one part of it. The second part of it is because we don't have because these economies don't have access to cutting edge new age technologies, the mining practices remain dated, and the wasteful mining practices lead to a depletion of reserves in the region. This is especially a challenge that is being discussed in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia. The mining practices also include sort of an impact on the water reserves in these countries, including the risk of acid mine drainage and process water leaks causing groundwater contamination. Besides the environmental challenges, there is also a risk of mining interfering with the local communities' economic activities in some of these regions. In Philippines, for instance, the livelihoods of the indigenous communities is threatened by the new plans for expansion of nickel mining. Lack of environmental regulations and ESG standards across the region which could be helpful in assessing the impact of mining projects remains a major concern specific to this particular region. There is also an observable lack of investments within the critical minerals value chain within the Asia Pacific region. The recovery and recycling of these minerals through urban mining remains low because there are high costs and technical complexities associated with the process. Structured investments in value chains remains low in the region, despite the countries having large tracts of untapped reserves. There is an uneven build-up of manufacturing capabilities, creating core and peripheral countries in the region. The countries which are rich in resources, they have a low manufacturing base, and they need access to capital and technology to move up the value chain. Additional resources are also needed for research and development and innovation to improvise on some of these technologies that are globally available for mining and extraction of some of these minerals. And finally, these are some of the key observations that we've observed as a part of our research. Number one being, this point comes up very frequently when we talk of the Asia Pacific region, and which is that although the region remains rich in critical mineral reserves, these remain largely untapped because of low investments in the mineral value chains. The mining practices remain unsustainable, throwing up several social and environmental challenges for the region. The downstream value addition remains low. Investments needed to create competitive outputs in technology and innovation also remain low. While the region is well poised for vertical integration into advanced value chains for batteries and EVs, it does not have that required amount of access to finance and technology to move up the value chains. Countries like Singapore, Japan, China, India, with their long-term technological landscape and strong R&D capabilities, can become useful for building these regional synergies on critical mineral economy. And of course, regional cooperation through some of the established institutions, for instance, the ARF, the G20, and some of these multilateral funding organizations could become fundamental in driving some of these investments, developing the norms for ESG standards, and facilitating vertical integration through technology transfer and finance.
Thank you, Dr. Niharika Attagotra, for that presentation. I now call upon the panel. I will introduce each one and they could probably come to the stage. The first panelist is Mr. Han Pao Min, who has more than 20 years of professional experience working at various international and intergovernmental organizations and multidisciplinary research consortiums related to energy, market and technologies, environment, integrated water resources management, governance, and economic development in the region of ASEAN and East Asia. Currently, he serves as a senior energy economist at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Much of his career in the past 12 years has revolved around the power sector, especially in the area of electricity, market integration, water to energy, and sustainable hydropower development. Mr. Pao Min, please. Yeah, thank you. We have two panelists joining us virtually. I will go ahead and introduce them. I hope they've already joined the excellent, and maybe we could have their slide up on the. Ms. Radia Sadawi is the chief of section in the Climate Change and Natural Resources Sustainability Cluster of the United Nations Economic Social Commission of West Asia since 2016. Ms. Sadawi, who has been unable to join us because she couldn't travel from Beirut, if I understand correctly, will be joining us online. She brings more than 22 years of experience in both private and public sector in energy, sustainable development, and climate change leadership, and development of programs in the field with track record and proven skills across several areas, including negotiation of partnerships, mobilization of resources, international and intergovernmental cooperation, and a wide network of stakeholders. Ms. Adawi has an extensive expertise in energy policy advice, oil and gas and carbon market development, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. And we have one more panelist who joins us online, who is joining us from New Delhi in India. Oh, okay. Nandakumar. I apologize. Dr. Nandakumar Janardhanan is Research Manager, Climate and Energy and South Asia Regional Coordinator at the Institute for Global Environment Strategies, Japan. His research interest includes technology co-innovation, critical minerals, energy and climate policy, hydrogen and air pollution. Dr. Janardhanan has about 2 decades of experience in policy research, market research, and academia. He worked with several noted academic institutions, including the Kyoto University in Japan, Federal University in Brazil, and the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. And finally, we have Dr. Peter Warren, who joins us here in person. Oh, there you are. Thank you. If you could take the stage. Dr. Warren is Head of Climate Finance for Innovation in the UK government's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. He manages the UK's international climate finance investments and international policy for clean energy and innovations. He previously led the former UK government Department of Energy and Climate Change's evidence, needs, and analysis on smart energy. Peter previously worked in the International Energy Agency on energy efficiency in emerging economies and worked as a sustainable management manager in industry. Peter holds a PhD in energy policy from the University College London. Thank you very much for joining. All right, so, and Niharika, if you can come to the podium as well. I unfortunately do not have our moderator's bio, which he's conveniently chosen to not include in what he's given me, but I briefly introduce Tirthankar Mandal, who is Head Energy Policy for WRI India, who would be moderating this session. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was a great introduction to the panel. I don't need to introduce any other. So I just straight away go into the, just to give you a brief, how do we conduct this panel discussion? Because it won't be a one-sided affair. We won't be talking always, because there would be like the first round, we will be delving upon what are the key issues, because Niharika has actually painted a broad brush about the key issues. So we will identify some of the issues, because we all understand that, well, demand and supply of these critical minerals is a part of the issue, but it's not the whole of the issue. So we would be more interested in understanding the other side of the story, which is around affordability, access, and then financing, investments, all of those things. We have esteemed panelists over here. And then we will actually open up the floor after the first round, which will talk about these challenges and challenges particularly, and the issues. And then we'll open up the floor from the audience to hear about their perspective, what they think about it, for another 10 minutes or so. And then we come back to the panelists again to actually sum them up and identify and address some of the solutions they actually have been talking about and they have been doing in their work as well. So having said that, I'll just open up the panel with Dr. Han, because you all know he has been a wide experience about the energy sector at the interface of energy trade and various other sectors. So Dr. Han, you have seen that the ASEAN region and the region as a whole has its roadmap for energy transition, not just the energy transition, but also several other sectors as well, like the EVs, battery storage and all, right? So it also requires huge amount of minerals as well. So now what I would like to hear from you is that how it is going to affect the transition, like particularly the mineral side of the story. Like all of these, most of these countries are going to be the net importer of these minerals, or one way or the other, they are either importing the minerals or they're going to import the net end products like the solar panels or the wind turbines or whatever, the batteries and all of these. So ultimately, they're going to be the net importers of all of these things. How it is going to affect their transition goals?
First of all, very good morning. I think as the introduction this morning, I think especially presentation from Niharika-san, okay, and thank the Titan Cast for my introduction. I think the question is why critical mineral is become a big topic at this time, because when the world committed to net zero emission or carbon neutrality by 2050, 60 or 70, I think some Europe and developing country commit toward 2050, but in ASEAN and some maybe developing country may not be able to achieve by 2050. So the target are vary between 60 or 70. And those, they are committed to those carbon neutrality. But in terms of target wise, in terms of energy related sector, transportation, residential, industry, I think it's quite weak. Some countries like moving quite fast, like Thailand, not yet Malaysia, even some countries like, okay, Indonesia have some target on EV rollout, Thailand, but we need to have very clear roadmap. Those, the political commitment toward carbon neutrality there, but much need to be done. And it's come to the need how they are going to transform the current energy infrastructure, which really rely on the fossil fuel based energy system that range from power generation to other infrastructure from supply chain. Many fossil fuel handling in the downstream and upstream that we still rely on those. And when it moving toward carbon neutrality, the transformation of those energy systems need to be done, which what it requires to do that transformation. In other words, it's you phasing out this fossil fuel dependent. It's mean energy infrastructure that we used to rely on coal, power, gas power generation and other need to gradually shift toward clean energy. What is mean? It's mean replacement those with renewable and clean technologies. When it coming to those pressure, I think first it involve cost, how we do that transformation, which can ensure accessibility and affordability. If you are pushing so hard, you push those assets to be strained asset and replace with new renewable infrastructure, the cost could be much more expensive than Europe, because Europe have done those infrastructure already in place, but we are not yet. So when we're coming to clean energy technologies, critical mineral become a secret success. When we need this critical mineral, because it's going to increase the production of wind turbine, EV batteries, electrolyzers. So when we are going to increase many times of those capacity in order to meet net zero emission, it's quite important how we secure those critical minerals. The deposit of those critical minerals everywhere, but the concentration is not sufficient to do commercially viable. Again, it become to like that this critical mineral not only a demand for clean technology, it demand for warfare weapon. That's US, Western country currently, they need this also. So they become competing demand. It will going to drive the price going very high. So I think securing supply chain and make sure it's accessible, affordable, and environmental acceptable is quite important, because mining going to continue a lot and environmental issue going to happen a lot, because these industry are very toxic. If we don't handling well, the region become just a toxic area that we should learn from US in the past before 1980s and China as well. So all in these quite important, that capability and skill in the production, refining and processing, that's quite important. And we need to concentrate on those. If it's ASEAN and East Asia want to be success, we need to address those critical important capacity investment and technology in the critical mineral. I stop here, perhaps a lot of questions later on. Sit back to you, Titanka. Thank you so much.
Very briefly, if I just probe on, because you just mentioned about the demand and then the competing demand for the minerals. Do you see emerging tension between the countries within the region, or more so between the countries from the region and outside the region, or both?
Yes. I think recently it's come to light that because China control both production, refining and processing, and they are controlling the supply chain almost 80 to more than 80%. And US rely on China in terms of import 80% of their rare earth mineral. Just right now that US understand this political issue, they are ramp up their production. But in this region, I think look at Indonesia, India, and some other countries that have good deposit of this rare earth mineral, but including Australia. But Indonesia become more resource nationalist. They don't want to share and export this critical mineral. I think this is one of the things. If they want to do domestically processing in the Indonesia, it can be fine, but it needs to address environmental issue. Look at those investments. I think they are not yet meet the environmental issue. So I think moving toward within the region of ASEAN East Asia, the country policy toward a resource nationality is quite dangerous. That could disrupt and make the price of the critical mineral become unavailable as needed. If we are going to increase this transition toward clean energy in the near future.
Yeah, thank you. And let me just, before moving to Dr. Radhia, can you just check whether she's is she audible? Dr. Radhia, are you audible? She couldn't connect. Oh,
Check.
okay, we'll come back to Dr. Radhia once she is connected. I'll go to Niharika, because Niharika, in your presentation, you highlighted about the vulnerabilities part quite a bit, right? And if you actually kind of go about like how these vulnerabilities actually are going to affect both the factors, because affordability and accessibility for these countries, because most of these countries are still, as you highlighted, that these are the countries who are going to be the net importers of the ultimately the end technologies for cleaner transition, right? So how this affordability and accessibility is going to be getting affected in this context?
Thanks, Deepankar, for that. When we look at the challenges to affordability and accessibility to for some of these minerals for the countries in the Asia Pacific region, we need to remain mindful of the fact that, and this is also something that I highlighted as a part of my presentation, that going forward, the demand for clean energy technologies, the demand for energy per se, and the carbon emissions are going to be, it's going to come from some of these economies in the region, because these are the economies which are looking to fast pace their economic development. And that cannot happen without a concomitant rise in energy demand. when that kind of when that kind of pace of economic development is undertaken, and that kind of demand for energy increases in the region, till the time these economies are not provided with that kind of technological and financial support to increase the domestic production of some of these clean energy technologies, and two, with access to some of these minerals to increase production of these technologies, the challenge to meet the climate change mitigation goals and the net zero goals, will become extremely difficult globally and as a collective, collectively for the world. When we talk of challenges to affordability and accessibility, we also need to remain mindful of the fact that the supply chains remain extremely vulnerable, considering that there is a concentration of these minerals in certain countries, and the processing, again, like Dr. Han highlighted, remains regionally concentrated. To meet these challenges, these supply chains need to be diversified. Countries within the Asia Pacific region, which have untapped resources for most of these minerals, they need to be supported through regional efforts, which can provide them with the necessary finance and technologies for creating these downstream value chains. And the more the diversification happens for some of these critical minerals within the region, the easier it will be for countries to access some of these minerals for their own productions.
Yeah. So I just hold on your thoughts on the solutions part of it. I just wanted to touch upon, because you mentioned about the downstream and upstream, about the supply chain. So what do you think about, because you also talked about untapped resources in this region, right? So what do you think about 2 or 3 top reasons why like these countries haven't actually been able to move up to the supply chain? Because you see countries like China and others, or for that matter, Korea, Japan, and many other countries have actually, whatever said and done, they have actually done something right to move from a certain level to the other level in terms of export of certain technologies. At least they have met some goals, right, done something right. But many of these countries in this region are yet to actually move from certain level of this, the supply chain jump or supply chain movement, that has mobility hasn't occurred despite the reserves, despite all good intention. Can you highlight 1 or 2 reasons for that?
Yes, I think we need to remain mindful of the fact that all of these are developing economies. And within these developing economies, the access to finance for tapping some of these reserves, converting them to commercial resources, and then using these resources to sort of move up the value chain becomes an important factor. And like I said, the structural investments within the critical mineral economies remains lower in the region. And it's not just the critical mineral economy, the structured investments within the clean energy technologies also remains extremely low in the region. And that's one part of it. The access to finance is one part of it. The next part is access to some of these technologies. And I don't mean in terms of just enhancing the imports of some of these technologies. When we talk of access to technologies, we also talk about countries having access to R&D, countries having access to innovation, and countries being able to use that sort of knowledge to prepare a manufacturing base for these technologies within the domestic economies. For these countries, that hasn't happened. This happens to be a challenge even for a country like India, which has the manufacturing base but remains extremely import dependent for technologies as well as critical minerals. So when we talk about those regional synergies, I think the challenges remain very very common to some of the Asia Pacific economies and for a country like India.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I quickly move on to Dr. Nandkumar, and those who are actually like tracking Dr. Radhya's status. If you just let me know if she's online or not. The moment she's online, we can just pass on to her. But Dr. Nandkumar, if you are online, he's online, right? So can you also, so you have been working on the investment side of it. So we have heard about the supply chain, we have heard about the affordability, accessibility, also the technology issues as well. So I just wanted to know from your perspective about what do you think are the 2 or 3 main issues that is in terms of attracting investments, because Niharika's concluding lines were like these countries were not being able to attract enough of investments and financing for whatever reasons. So taking cue from that, if you can actually highlight 1 or 2 or 3 main reasons why the countries were not being able to attract enough of investments, particularly in the critical mineral sector, and also linked to the other issues as well.
Thank you, Tirthankar. And can you hear me?
Yeah, a bit louder, please.
Am I audible? Okay. So thank you so much, Tirthankar. And I would also like to thank WRI team and my previous speakers, Dr. Han and Dr. Niharika, for outlining the major issues already witnessing in this sector. When we come to, so sorry about my video. I see that my internet connection is not very good. So I'm afraid that if I switch on my video, my voice might go. So let me continue like this. Specifically, the point which you have mentioned about what is sort of stopping or what is affecting the investments in this region is that these are like sort of the basic facts which we all know about infrastructure constraints, regulatory issues, and then sort of a technical expertise or capacity many of these countries have. When we come to infrastructure constraints, there's a lack of sort of adequate infrastructure in many of these places, including transportation networks, power supply, and even sort of processing facilities that are critical for the development of development and even extraction of these materials, these critical minerals. This hampers the sort of efficient and to some extent cost-effective production of critical minerals. And that's how actually this region largely becomes less sort of attractive for investments. Similarly, regulatory challenges again is a big issue in many of these places, especially the sort of presence of complex and inconsistent regulations related to mining and mineral exploitation in the region is sort of has been creating sort of uncertainty for investors. And this, to some extent, we should also say that the policies are sort of appear to be inconsistent in many places, and then also bureaucratic delays or the concerns about bureaucratic hurdles and in terms of the difficulties in obtaining permits and licenses. See, these are all actually have been largely the issues under the regulatory challenges. Now, technical capacity and expertise, critical mineral, the concerns about critical mineral we are discussing here today. As we know, the sector has been active for a long time, but the sudden attention it gains, it also opens up the question about what kind of technical expertise or capacity many of these countries have. And that shows us that the region suffers from lack of technical expertise and capacity in terms of, say, if it is in the exploration or extraction or processing. Now, this absence of this skilled professionals or advanced technologies, as previous speakers pointed out, and sort of research and development capabilities has been affecting the sector for a long time. But I believe some of the points which I mentioned, infrastructure or regulatory or even the capacity issues, these are all will be addressed in the coming years, because now we are getting more and more focused on these issues. And I hope actually these issues can be addressed in the coming years. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Nandkumar. You talked about the very interesting points about the capacities and all, and I would just have a follow-up, kind of a slightly modified question about the follow-up question, which is slightly modified in terms of capacities, right? And we often talk about the regional cooperation to overcome some of these challenges which you have highlighted, right? And almost all of these challenges are often talked about in a broad brush, that regional cooperation can actually meet or address all of these challenges which you have highlighted. But we don't often see a lot of regional cooperation, even in this new, even in the context of critical minerals, let alone others as well. Because I just mentioned critical minerals because when you talk about these new sectors coming up, it also opens up opportunities to actually put aside the old baggages and go for more and more new types of regional cooperation. Do you see, can you highlight in the context of, particularly in the context of critical minerals, how this regional cooperation is, or the challenges in regional cooperation is actually playing out? You sort of touched upon, but if you can give us a bit of specificity in those points.
Thank you, Tirthankar. I mean, in fact, we all agree that regional cooperation is one of the important solutions to address many of the challenges countries actually have been facing. And one of the important elements here is that to what extent the national interests of countries are harmonized, or is there a policy coordination when it comes to the policies related to exploration and development and processing and all those related to critical minerals. So even in the context of, say, South-South cooperation framework or something, which may have diverse national interest. So aligning this national interest is going to be one of the most challenging. At the same time, can also be a promising area to address many of the issues that we face. And so even sort of technology transfer and how actually South-South cooperation can probably facilitate some sort of technology sharing and cooperation. So this is like sort of one of the main issues. And as I mentioned, policy coordination and harmonization. So achieving or having sort of a policy coordination and harmonization among countries that needs to collaborate is crucial. And but at the same time, like differing regulatory framework, various kind of different regulatory frameworks or standards and policies related to critical minerals and its exploration or extraction and trade. These are all actually remain sort of challenges. And as I mentioned, technology transfer or technology sharing among South-South cooperation often involves, especially like, the fact here is that about technology transfer, technology sharing, like it's not about South-South cooperation, but it involves developed countries and developing countries to collaborate. But we all know that conventionally technology transfer has happened not as a transfer, but in many cases as a sale of technology and at a subsidized rate. So as far as we are actually operating the technology transfer on a sort of a conventional on a platform, things will not be very helpful here. And again, like in terms of infrastructure development, there's a need for adequate infrastructure in all the countries, including transportation networks, or power supply, or the processing facilities, and all these are actually will be sort of crucial when we think of possibilities of collaboration. And even mobilizing finances and sort of attracting investments also will be challenging, especially in developing countries. I have already mentioned the reasons why. And so there are several challenges, but also it opens up, it points us that these are the critical areas, and if we can start addressing these, then we would definitely be able to address many of the challenges which we are facing today. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I just move on to, because you give me an interesting way to actually come to Peter, who is actually kind of in a position that facilitates many of these aspects of how to facilitate these challenges, right? And often, because Peter is a finance specialist, climate finance specialist, and people often in the room, actually not in the room, but in more of a larger space, often talk about how climate finance and critical minerals are linked, and that is why we specially have him as one of our panelists, because we all know how climate finance has been happening across the world, be it GCF or be it almost all major bilateral countries have their own climate finance portfolios, and it has a large chunk of this thing for clean energies as well. But how do you actually link those, or what are the challenges basically to link the critical minerals being a kind of nascent areas? Because you have, for renewable energies, you have the set norms and set ROIs to understand, or at least for the grid scale and all big technologies, you understand what are the investments and all of those things. From the climate financing perspective, the issues that Dr. Nandkumar was highlighting about the technology sale cooperation and all of those things, those are the issues at one side of the story. And you have this climate finance. When you are going to finance it, you need to talk about in financing aspects, how these two are going to, like these two challenges, how do you kind of address those, or what are they placed?
I just test this works.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like you want me to come up with all the solutions. So I'll try to, in the second half, give some of my thoughts on that. But thank you first for inviting me to the panel. I really appreciate the opportunity to get across some of our thinking and early work in this space as well. So in terms of the key challenges, I mean, if we look at climate finance in terms of flows of funding from developed to developing countries, in terms of official development assistance, and use that sort of lens to think about it, it is a relatively new area to look at critical minerals per se. Now, there are some few small existing trust funds out there, like the World Bank's Climate Smart Mining Initiative, which primarily focuses upstream. And we've heard from other panelists that it's not just about the upstream mining, but very much about midstream and downstream. How do you process? How do you recycle, repurpose? And we're sort of increasingly looking at that part of the chain as well. And I'll talk about that a bit later in the second half of the panel discussion. But in terms of the key challenges, I mean, firstly, that's one of them, which is there aren't a lot of existing funds out there that look specifically at this. Most of it's been looked at through the lens of clean energy funds. I also think that's a solution in itself. I think while this continues to be two separate discussions and two separate dialogues, the funding from the climate finance side is probably not going to increase much. But as soon as you integrate it with clean energy transitions, as we heard from Dr. Han as well about the importance of the increase of critical minerals within renewable transitions and Asia Pacific's capacity to be able to boost up the renewable supply, I think that's going to be really crucial to make links to things like industrial decarbonization and the use of minerals in that, clean transport switches, clean power switches and grid integration, as opposed to looking at setting up individual critical minerals focused mining funds. So I think they're inherently integrated. And I think that's a crucial way to access the finance. The second challenge I would say is where and how to target that support. So again, most of the different sort of, let's say, the key things that have been said so far are about the role of standards, the role of technical assistance types of mechanism, that's sort of more grant financing types of approach. But where you really want to get to the big scale, and I look at sort of innovation and how do you accelerate the commercialization of new clean tech across all these different sectors. You got to look at the interplay between things like technical assistance with capital investment financing, and what's the type of capital investment financing. And there are newer financial models that have been looked at which haven't really been tested so much in clean energy, such as pool mechanisms, pool financing. So the role of things like advanced market commitments, can that be applied to critical minerals? Green public procurement approaches, or taking lessons from the forestry and biodiversity, which have looked at results-based financing techniques. Can that be applied to sort of clean energy transitions with the critical minerals lens? So this is an area we're sort of looking at a bit more, but I'll talk a bit more about that sort of after. Two other really quick points. I think expertise and skills is a third challenge. So I think that's an area where we really need to boost. So it's not just about expertise and skills more broadly across the critical minerals portfolio. I mean, really specifically, we also need to boost it in the finance side of things. So boost in the financial industry's capability, in skills and development, both in country and those sort of invest in, also in governments as well, the knowledge of what types of financing instruments would work in what way for who, for what stakeholders, and how they interrelate. And then the final challenge I'd say is already been mentioned by the panelists, which is about the role of ESG and really improving ESG standards and harmonizing standards, as was said by the previous speaker. So if you haven't looked at the UK's critical mineral strategy, I very much recommend looking at that. It came out last year in July, and ESG is a big focus of that. How do we set high standards for that? And then, the UK itself going to trying to lead by example by doing that within the UK as well.
Yeah, and that actually leads me to the second question, which is more of a follow-up question, is that you talked about both the critical minerals as well as the energy transition technologies. So when we talk about energy transition technologies, those are almost like the end products which originates from the critical minerals. Do you see climate financing actually for this part of the countries of the world? Do you see there is an inherent challenge in these two sectors emerging, or there is going to be no challenge at all? They will balance themselves.
Do you mean in terms of the finance going
Exactly,
flows to
financial
both?
flows?
So I think it's just the way that it's badged, and in a lot of cases, it's the way that those proposals are presented. Because in a lot of cases, you'll see increasingly a bigger number of renewable energy projects and industrial decarbonisation projects that will include elements of critical minerals as part of those projects, and we see that coming through in some of the proposals. I think inherently linking that as well to the Sustainable Development Goals is going to be absolutely crucial. So we're going to kick off some work towards the end of the year, at the start of 2024, to look at this, to try and look at how do you map critical minerals in a clean energy context with the Sustainable Development Goals. Like, what are the impacts across the 17 goals? And I think that's one way to link it. So I think the summary of my argument is, I think as long as we look at it in isolation and still look at it as different components, and we've seen that, for example, in the World Bank, where the extractive side and the clean energy side are both under the same sort of directorate, but as perhaps not as integrated as they could be. So the more integrated they are, the more likely the access to finance will be.
Yeah, I think that's actually gives a lot of area for, and maybe a lot of questions around the audience to actually ask to our esteemed panelists or get a clarification around. So without getting into more weeds into it, I just open up the floor for our audience. Please introduce yourself and direct it to the, yes, sir, please.
Good morning, and thank you for your wonderful inputs. I'm Ray Panaligan. I'm from local group Center for Renewable Energy, but I'm also sits in the board of the CAN International and CAN Southeast Asia. So even before attending, we know that mining industry, the mining sector is really problematic. And hearing from the discussions right now, that seems things will get worse because of the high demand, because of the energy transition. I want to shift again the discussion since we're part that this session is part of the Asia Clean Energy Forum, and I want to shift the discussions on the role of the ADB. ADB has been part of many disastrous mining projects in the past. Here in the Philippines, one of the biggest mining disasters that happened here in 1996, it was funded. It was because of a company funded by ADB. And I think my question is, from your perspective, in terms of the discussions on securing sustainable mining in terms of critical minerals, what do you think is how ADB right now fare into this discussion, and what are probably your recommendations in moving forward for the ADB to be able to really, not just talking about sustainable mining, but really doing doing everything and seeing through that the national standards, the ESGs are really being implemented on the ground.
You can keep it.
Thank you so much. I think your question quite interesting. I think Peter already have highlighted some of the important issue around financing of this critical mineral. But I think the question is whether those multilateral banking should, I think, continues provide funding to mining industry, such as for rare earths, critical mineral. At the same time, those institutions like ADB and other also pursue the net zero emission we are pushing. So you want to reach a goal which, without the understanding a critical important element that going to provide that vehicle to reach the net zero emission, that is not fair. But I think what happened in the past, I think it's that's not safe, because the rare earth price going to shoot many times if you raise the environmental bar standards. Why the rare earth mineral supply side so far, it's still relatively cheap. Recently, it's going very high. Because I think because of the supply demand crunch itself, but by looking for sustainable mining, secure supply in the supply chain, you need to provide very safe mining with a very high standard of environment, from mining, processing, production, and refining and processing. So in that case, the cost I expect to shoot very high. So I think I would encourage those multilateral banking, including clean financing, look into this area in order to make sure we're able to success for decarbonization. Otherwise, you lack of this critical input. You're not able to provide them in I think in an affordable manner. Otherwise, we cannot afford. If you scale up those lock-in investment, that's quite important. And of course, you need to roll out measure that this critical mineral have to go to industry for clean financing. It's not go to weapon. It's not go other. So you need to lock in agreement of takers and lock in certain investment to secure the supply chain of clean financing to this particular clean technology, not go to weapon, not go to other missile. That's quite important. I think we need to find way to fund of this critical mineral. That's my point.
Yeah, I very much agree with the points made by Dr. Han. I mean, I would say, just to add to that, the Sustainable Critical Minerals Alliance that was set up last year with a big focus on setting high ESG standards for all operations and projects is something a lot of the MDBs, I would say, should be doing. Sort of setting up and agreeing to those standards would be a first sort of port of call. I would say, how does the ADB fare to other MDBs? When it comes to the more midstream, downstream side of things, less on the upstream part, I would say it's slightly behind some of the other MDBs. So I mentioned before the World Bank's Climate Smart Mining Initiative. That does actually also look midstream and downstream, not just upstream. There isn't really a equivalent facility trust fund within the ADB. So it might be that either a trust fund set up or that it's integrated into existing trust funds like the Clean Energy Financing Partnership Facility, would be an obvious home within the ADB for that. The leader at the moment is the UN's Industrial Development Organization, so UNIDO, and I'd come on to that actually a bit later as well.
Dr. Nandkumar, if you want to add briefly to that, or we can go
Thank
to
you,
the next.
Tirthanga. In fact, this is an interesting question. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, the question is that the critical minerals sector, I mean, if you look at the mining and extraction activities, there are a lot of environmental issues are coming out, and also there are concerns about energy just transition. From the just transition perspective, or from the safety of those workers who are actually involved in this sector. So there are multiple challenges that are already there as an inherent part of this sector. And how, to what extent ADB can, or ADB or any sort of multilateral, these MDBs can actually sort of fund mining activities or exploration activities are sort of largely depend on their own policies. For example, ADB has, I think in 2021, they have already declared that several mining projects are actually, they will not support. I think under the ADB's, if I'm right, 2021 policy, they'll not support coal mining, processing or storage and transportation. So there are actually sort of changing, approaches from this banks. But the possible areas where some sort of support can actually come from these banks are like, say, promoting responsible mining practices and working with the local governments or regional governments in terms of offering some sort of loans and grants and technical assistance that can sort of bridge the gap, bridge the financing gap, and sort of stimulate investment. Or as I mentioned, like the responsible mining practices, to what extent the responsible mining needs to be there. And also even points like, say, how can actually, these banks can sort of facilitate integration of a value chain within the region. So that comes under probably the purview of ADB, and how to promote regional cooperation. So some of those areas are actually can be done by banks, but at the same time, several other areas there is a inherent limitation. So that we should keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yeah, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Dennis from Marketing Finance and stockholder on the various mineral energy listed on the Philippine Stock Exchange. My question is, what is the stand of the APEC region on the Paris Agreement alignment on carbon emission and clean energy, the journey to net zero? First world countries are pressuring APEC countries rich on critical mineral reserves, especially third world countries yet reaching mineral deposits for transition to nuclear energy. Third world countries might have a hard situation on restructuring their energy sector from mineral-based energy power plants to nuclear. What challenges, initiative, and plans would countries rich on critical mineral reserves to continue using to run their economy without the pressure of first world countries run on nuclear energy?
Would you like to, any of you want to take that up?
You repeat shortly. I mean, what is the key message you want us to address?
Because even on using on oil and energy and other minerals reserve, they're still producing carbon emission. But unlike there is trying to explain that nuclear energy is much cleaner, yet more disastrous.
Thank you so much. I think quite interesting the question from ASEAN perspective, I think we do not like to have nuclear in the backyard. We always like that, but it has been proved very safe and like SMR, small modular reactors. It's quite promoting and quite safe in I think promoting and contributing to this decarbonizing the emission. But ASEAN perspective, I think we keep nuclear as an option, but we will not use it unless we have no choice, because this region have abundant resources, particularly like Philippines, enormous resources of wind power offshore, and you have geothermal. I think other ASEAN countries have abundant of solar. This can deploy largely to replace fossil fuel. And the matter is how we going to balance the grid. You need to upgrade those facilities, and all the new solar have to come with wind and others, whether with hydro or whatever. It has to have the somehow battery storage. And those, if we are in the energy sector, you understand that the hybrid system that could reduce the backup capacity, which is reduce the overall cost of generation, could be easily understood if the region can be well connected in terms of grid. So we are talking about if the region of ASEAN can connect to East Asia, like particularly India, I think very beneficial, and connect India to the rest of South India probably is the best. I think by having this innovative grid connectivity, driving cost of battery storage, and also this all this end use technology. If all this technology innovation can happen, I think we're able to reduce the decarbonization cost. Another word is abatement cost, which is a proxy of carbon price that we are saying, what is suitable carbon price in this region? To decarbonize the whole system, to my understanding, the modeling say very high, over 300 to 600 US dollar per ton, which is not affordable. With the carbon price just over 100 US dollar in Europe, and in Asia introduced very low. And even Indonesia just provide $2 for carbon price at the power generation. This not ASEAN cannot able to achieve. I think that we need to look for innovation, driving down costs, and make all this grid connectivity. Then we can use our resource more friendly and then more clean. I stop here. Perhaps we can discuss further on that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Han. I think your question was mainly on the role of nuclear energy within the Asia-Pacific region, if I'm being more clear here.
Yes, actually, what I see here is a scenario that these first world countries have already depleted their mineral reserves, but they have the capacity to build these nuclear power plants.
Okay.
But third world countries might have problems because generating or having a nuclear power plant or reactor is very expensive. So they're trying to, what I see, a scenario here that they're pressuring third world countries so that third world countries might convert their energy sector from mineral reserves or run power plants to nuclear.
Okay,
That's what
I'll
I
just
see.
take that one. I think nuclear is being considered a safe option. If I'm not wrong, UK has also listed nuclear as one of the alternative clean energy technologies. But this resource also comes with its own set of challenges. We've seen how the costs of building nuclear power plants and the time of building these power plants have generally run into decades. The time has run into decades. The costs run into billions. Once you start off with the construction of a power plant, it takes about 3 decades to finish it, and by the time you're done with it, it has already absorbed billions of dollars. Well, small modular reactor technology is something that is sparking a lot of interest among countries. I do feel that technology is also at a stage where it needs to be commercially scaled for some of these developing countries to bring it into use. The safety aspects of this technology also has to be demonstrated. Final point here, I think we also need to be extremely mindful of the fact that nuclear has its own safety challenges, and especially in geographies, in geographies like the Asia Pacific countries, which are already very prone to some of these climate disasters, some of these natural disasters. Maintaining the safety of nuclear power plants becomes a challenge. While there are conversations that we are beginning to initiate on nuclear power, especially given the fact that they died after 2011, there are some inherent challenges with these technologies that we need to be mindful of.
Yeah, please. Very, yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I am Gloria Tirado. I am a I'm a lawyer and a student for the master's degree. That's why I joined this one. I'm very interested. I am not a technical person in terms of renewable energy, and although I have a background, I used to work with the Energy Regulatory Commission. So this is an economic regulator, but not as a lawyer, but as an administrator. So that's why this question, I don't know if this will make sense, but I'm more focused on the policy side. So on the regionalization aspect of the Asia, I would like to ask, sir, if I'm on the finance side, if the single currency will help in terms of, I've heard Dr. Coomer spoke about the national interest as one of the critical issues to be addressed in order for Asia to go into this transition speedily because of the 2050 target. So one is the single currency. Second is I do understand that countries in Asia have different laws to consider in terms of mining or getting these minerals and the ownership of this one. So it's the harmonization actually of the respective laws of the country. So if there will be a platform or something like that ADB can help us. That's these are mere thoughts of me, because I am really looking into making a paper wherein I can help the government also enlightened in this particular aspect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. I think a very nice and interesting question that I think if the region or ASEAN or East Asia may want to move to a single currency, I think you probably see the European Union have a euro, right? And it's the countries when you're moving up toward a single currency and you do not throw away your own currency. That is the problem also, because you need to balance. It depends on import, export, how you balance internal to maintain inflation and others. Single currency is okay, but I mean how to maintain those in terms of inflation and others, it's quite important. And given a variety of economic background in ASEAN, I think toward that single currency perhaps may be quite difficult at this stage. Even European, I think given some advanced country and less GDP countries per capita GDP that they join, they also struggle to balance their domestic currency. Quite to some extent, quite difficult to maintain that. But why we want to maintain single currency? Just simply because of trade. Because when you do clearance in terms of trade, so in this region, I think so far we use dollars. Basically, it's very strong unless you have a very strong regulator and others. Because it's not just establish a single currency you're able to success. How to maintain, how to regulate. So it's very complex. Like look at the US. unless you really establish very strong network how to maintain those single currency. Otherwise, I will not recommend. I probably
I have Ranjit and then Preeti.
She had a follow-up question on the policy harmonization.
We
I don't know.
are running
Oh,
out.
we're running.
I am mindful of that, but
Okay.
we are running out of. So
Hi, thank you. My name is Reshmi. I'm from WWF. My question is that given that specifically looking at Southeast Asia or the ASEAN region, the kind of climate finance that was expected to be raised for the clean energy transition hasn't come through still. How do you think, addressing critical minerals and raising the kind of finance that is needed will be addressed, or what are the solutions to do that?
we will be taking up in the
All right,
solutions.
cool, thanks.
Preeti.
Hello everyone, my name is Preeti. I'm from WRI India Energy Program. My question is since critical mineral resources are also limited, should a parallel discussion also starts on capping the utilization or extraction of these resources, and considering also the fact that Asian countries are still in the development phase. So for the energy transition to take place, what are the sustainable or the regulatory environment are there, and should there be a cap, especially for the developing countries when it comes to extraction of these resources? Yeah, thanks.
So, Dr. Nandakumar, Niharika. Yeah.
Yeah, just on the last point, actually, I think most of the analysis that's come out from WRI and IEA, etc., sort of shows that you can't get the mineral intensity that's needed for clean energy transitions through repurposing and secondary reuse alone, and that actually there does need to be some new primary extraction in almost all the scenarios that I've seen.
Exactly. Niharika, you want that?
Thanks for your question, Preeti. I think there is an ongoing discussion looking at creating a sort of a circular economy, in these critical minerals, so that, going forward, when we, probably a decade from now, we are also able to successfully and affordably mine some of these minerals from the existing technologies, also a term which is called urban mining. But like I also mentioned in my presentation, the urban mining needs, right now it's associated with high costs, it's associated with a lot of technical complexities. And for that to happen at a commercial scale, for that to become affordable for countries, again, there are certain gaps that need to be, plugged in. Circular economy is definitely picking up, but especially at least in the critical minerals domain, we are still at a nascent stage for that to happen.
Yeah, so I straight away go to the solution. So, and there are questions about the climate finance and related to how to address the part. And I also hinted about, so without going, how do you actually, Peter? Floor is yours.
Well, I don't have all the answers, all the solutions, but one sort of new development that we did, we announced at sort of COP27, and then was sort of formally launched actually last month. So very recent, is a new climate finance facility, which tries to address some of the things I was saying earlier. So it's called the Accelerate to Demonstrate facility, which is £65 million, which is about $82.4 million in equivalent. And that's a grant facility that has a whole dedicated pillar on critical minerals. And it's, as far as we know, a world first in terms of actually having a dedicated trust fund that's looking at this topic across the whole upstream, midstream, downstream, and particularly the latter two, because we know the World Bank's doing a bit on the sort of upstream side. So this looks at some of the elements that the rest of the panel has mentioned on R&D and the importance of innovation. So it's an innovation platform trying to accelerate sort of new tech in critical minerals across different sectors. So industry, transport, power sector, it's sectoral agnostic. It also has a cross-cutting pillar and a hydrogen pillar as well as part of that. And that's delivered through the UN's Industrial Development Organization, so UNIDO. So it's very much at the sort of setup phase, but I think it can start funding projects from next year, so from early 2024. One of the first projects will be a massive market assessment study which will try and look at what is the landscape of innovators on critical minerals globally, what is the demands from country, and it will build off some of the analytical work that's been done by WRI and IEA and others, but really will look at the practicality of the markets for those that then will shape pipelines of projects. So pretty excited about that one. That's a really cool new development. There are a few other programs that exist that look at it through the lens of, say, clean energy. So there's something that the UK set up as well called the Clean Energy Innovation Facility. That's a £50 million program, or $62.9 million in equivalent. And that focuses on industrial decarbonisation, digitalisation and sustainable cooling. And what that aims to do is to actually, some of the work streams in all three of those look at critical minerals as well. So although the main focus is how do you decarbonize, say, iron and steel, etc., there are work streams within that look at circular economy, that look at recycling of materials. That was set up in 2019. So we actually do have projects that are now at the stage of closing, including one that closes in August this year. So we actually have impacts now, whereas the previous program I mentioned is that setup phase, so there's no impacts. But the other one, we can actually start to share the types of projects, how are they funded, which countries. They cover Asia Pacific, Africa and Latin America, so they're global programs. And I know we have some projects in Asia. The other sort of key things is through the lens of energy storage. So this has been one of the themes that has looked at critical minerals the most, actually, of all the themes. So the World Bank's Energy Storage Partnership has a whole section on how do you look at battery recycling, lithium-ion, alternatives to lithium-ion in batteries. And that's sort of the leading global partnership. And it's a developing country focused partnership. And it's got lots of members from Asia Pacific as well as other parts of the world. And the next sort of meetings and events is actually in the UK. So actually hosting that in Loughborough straight after the Asia Clean Energy Forum as well, to discuss that. It's also hybrid, so people can join. And then I think finally, just some of the wider partnerships, I would say is the third point. I think partnerships are going to be absolutely crucial for solutions. It's really, exciting to see some of the work streams in, for example, the G7, the Japanese-led work on critical minerals through the G7, India's lead within the G20 on critical minerals. I think linking the climate finance discussions to those wider political initiatives will be absolutely essential. And that's something I think there could still be more work on, is making those links. To give you a few sort of really specific examples, the UK set up with Australia something called the Joint Supply Chain Resilience. And as part of that, it's about supporting countries across the region, particularly the first countries that have been sort of involved in that, the Philippines, Malaysia, Bangladesh, and Singapore have been involved in that, and at the government level, and have been very positive about looking at supply chain resilience through initiatives like that. And then finally, just going back to a point I made before about the Sustainable Critical Minerals Alliance, that was a Canada-led initiative that countries like the UK, US, Australia are sort of part of, which is a global alliance to sort of support countries around the world to look at this.
Yeah, thank you. And I move on to Dr. Nandakumar, because basically he has been working on the investment side of it. And a lot of these questions which has been raised actually links back to the unlocking the investment as well. And Dr. Nandakumar in his recent paper about G20 has talked about some of these options. So if you can highlight around two of the critical options or solutions which can be used in this context about both unlocking, just not unlocking the climate finance, but also unlocking investments in this sector for the critical minerals and in the context of critical minerals and energy transition. Dr. Nandakumar, very briefly.
Thank you, Tirtha. Yeah. So I think this is actually an important question, and how to raise finances for the sector has been a major concern. And we had a recent work which was led by the Columbia University, and where we had actually participated in that. So quickly, like my answer is like we observe that certain blended finance, blended funding operations could be considered, because this could be sort of a limited liability debt facilities, or which can actually provide private equity funding. And we believe that such structures will give sort of investors to mitigate, an option to mitigate risk associated with maybe high capital costs. And so this is actually like one of the options which we think can be sort of an option where we could think of raising funds. And even project financing, especially from the project financing perspective, blended finance, like blended capital that aims to utilize sort of creditworthiness of certain entities to finance high risk or low return projects. That also can actually be used. But at the same time, we believe that this is again a sort of the understanding of how actually finances can be raised for the sector is sort of largely depend on the changing scenarios, or it's still sort of evolving. So but the main point here is that blended finance can actually be one of the options here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just pass on to Niharika for her observation on addressing some of the solutions around equity and affordability issues, just to the vulnerability aspect that you have highlighted. Just be very brief, because I'm told we are running out of time.
I'll, to address some of these equity and affordability issues, I think I'll sort of try and present 3 pointers that I feel are going to form a part of the solution. I think the first would be enhancing regional cooperation within this particular region. It's not like countries have not done it before. Within the Asia Pacific region, we have regional forums such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, which has demonstrated experience in overcoming some of these persistent structural challenges in some of these other domains. And I think that experience can be utilized within the domain of critical minerals and clean energy technologies. This regional cooperation can also become sort of a precursor to development of standards and norms. I do understand that the harmonization of these laws cannot happen overnight, but I do feel that countries that are which we characterize as the haves and the have-nots, when they come together on a common platform, there can be certain standards which can be developed, which could be beneficial to both set of countries, and that could actually address some of these equity issues, inter-country equity issues. And then finally, I think I'll also touch upon the financing bit of it, and there could be a thought process that could be initiated on developing these taxonomies in financing some of these sustainable mining projects within some of these regional financial institutions. I think once those taxonomies and those norms are developed in consultation with the countries that are important stakeholders, I think that could also go, that could go really forward in addressing some of these equity issues within the region.
Dr. Han, if you just can highlight about the regional cooperation, because given your background and experience, and there in the room, there has been an overarching concern about how do we better coordinate within the region around this aspect. So just very briefly, if you can just talk about the regional cooperation.
I think thank you so much for that point. I think that what the ASEAN want to have, I think the regional cooperation quite important in terms of technology transfer, knowledge transfer. Because let's say, I think what we are predicting that we are always need this a lot of demand of the critical mineral. We're not able to account for what all the junk TV and mobile phone and all equipment we use. If we're able to recycle those, I think the demand may not meet that level. We don't need to do much mining. I think those not been taken into account. So I think ability to recycle effectively within the region is needed. So how those technologies transfer through regional cooperation in the region of ASEAN itself have to do very well with Japan that have knowledge on this. But for critical mineral, China have accumulated knowledge. Don't undermine China on this sector. They used to pollute a lot, but at this point in time, they accumulate enough knowledge on this processing and refining industry. We need to learn. And US now start to pick up, and you need to raise the bar of environmental sustainability. Then you expect the cost going to shoot high. That's point, I think, to mine less, you need to do recycle. And then to do that, you need knowledge to do it well. So that's my point. Thank you.
Not attempting to actually summarize this varied spectrum of not the views, but varied spectrum of important points that has been highlighted. But I just want to highlight one point which is related to ADB and which Ray has highlighted. I think there is a scope to actually engage with the opportunity, engage with the ADB a lot more in this area, because I see this is an emerging area where ADB is also in a listening mode as well. And it's better to actually strategize ourselves means the civil societies in the region, to actually engage with them right from the beginning, which we didn't do in the other sectors when the fossil fuel industries were going and they were also financing. So that's the critical difference between the earlier time and the present time. So I think we should take that opportunity, and I end the panel discussion over here and pass it on to Kunal to take it forward and close it formally.
All right. I think we're already, we've probably overshot by about 15 minutes. So I would like to call upon Deepak Krishnan again to give the closing remarks.
I'll keep it very brief. Thank you all for this very enriching discussion, and thank you to the audience for also being so engaged and asking very pertinent questions. I think this is a topic where we'll still debate a lot more. There will be more questions than answers at the moment. On topics like finance flows, governance, circularity, responsible mining, R&D, and there are a lot of synergies with the clean energy sector itself. And there is a lot more of cross-sectoral connect, as you mentioned. A lot of these minerals are being used in mobile phones and other electronics. So that kind of cross-sectoral connect will also come in. So systems thinking, I think, is what we need to bring in to solve this problem. So thank you once again. And Kunal, next we'll be going for lunch.
Yeah, served outside.
You can bring the food back in here if you wish to, or stand around there and talk.
All join us for lunch.
Please join us for lunch.
Thank you.